Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again. Today, I wanted to continue on with talking about some of the key terminology in the ecological approach. And for today, I wanted to focus on one term, basically, one of the most critical and key terms in the ecological approach, the idea of constraints. So I want to focus on constraints and then spin off into talking about a use of constraints, very specific use of it, called the constraints-led approach, which are importantly are different things. So before I get into this, I wanted to mention that what I'm going to talk about is a small chunk of something that I've created on my website. So on my website, perceptionaction.com, I've created a constraints-led approach resource page. So on that, you will find infographics, definitions of key terminology, links to articles about the theoretical foundations, links to articles about studies that have compared the constraints-led approach with other methods, links to books that have described how to use the CLA in specific sports like golf and soccer. So, and also, I think I've done 5 episodes or so of about on the podcast about constraints-led approach, so you can find a link in a playlist to those there. So I created this as hopefully a good launching point for if you want to get into the constraints-led approach, or even if you are already in it and you want to continue to develop your ability to use it and add to it. I'm going to keep updating this page with all the new resources and articles that come out. So I'll definitely, hopefully you'll check that out if you are interested in this. But today, let's look at getting into this. A good place to start when talking about constraints is with Bernstein. Bernstein's a good place to start when talking about anything related to motor learning and motor control. But where we can start with this is talking about his famous degrees of freedom problem. And if you're really interested in this and want more, I've added on my YouTube channel, I've uploaded another video of a presentation I did a few months ago talking about the Bernstein problem, freeing degrees of freedom and things like that in a much more detail. So check that out if you're interested. But the basic idea and the problem that Bernstein identified, which arguably remains the most single important problem in motor control, is the idea that the human body, this wonderful system that is the human body, has all of these components, right? These bones, joints, muscles that can move in all these different ways, right? So with our shoulder, we can move it essentially in 3 different dimensions. For example, this wonderful capacity, right, creates a problem, right? And this is a general problem for human beings. Choice creates confusion, right? When you design a microwave with a million settings, people get confused. Well, your body's essentially no different, right? When you give it so many different options to move, right, what Bernstein called degrees of freedom in the choice of how you can solve a particular movement problem, you create a problem. How do we come up with an answer? How do we come up with a solution? How do we control all these different possibilities and create a coordination solution? And that's Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem. And the task that I'm going to focus on today is throwing, right? In my examples. And the problem was nicely specified in detail in a chapter by Turvey and colleagues, where they explained that if you just focus on the task of throwing and you look at the arm, right? Look at the muscles and joints involved in the arm. There's actually 26 different values you could set, right? 26 different things and all the possible combinations of those, right? To move your arm to throw a ball, right? And the point they were trying to make is, in support of the ecological approach, is that there's no way you could specify all 26 of these ahead of time to know for every possible situation, right? So that's which would be kind of an information processing approach, right? But the degrees of freedom problem is, how do I solve the problem of coordination when I have all these different options, all these different ways to move? Okay. And to understand this, right, again, I want to talk about throwing, and I want to talk about so how do we come up with a solution for how to throw a ball? And in understanding how we come up with a coordination solution, how we coordinate the degrees of freedom, what I like to think about it is in terms of a solution space, right? So a solution space is a set of possible values, the possible degrees of freedom, which the individual task environmental system could take for a particular movement problem, right? So it represents all your possible choices, right? And with any task, there's multiple solution spaces. But what I've shown here and what I want to focus on today is the solution space if we look at the relationship between your shoulder and your elbow when you pitch, right? So what I've tried to show in that graph there is a solution space created by the combination of these two things, right? So in theory, in a vacuum, right, you could throw a ball by using any combination of shoulder angle and elbow angle, right? That's why I put that big question mark there. What do you do? Where do I go in there? What part of the solution space do I need to be in to throw effectively? So that's the basic idea. Solution space is all the possible options you have to move, right? And what I'm going to use these for, I'm using these figures very conceptually, so don't take the values too seriously. I'll show you a real solution space plot with movement data near the end, okay? So the problem, how do I find my spot in the solution space? Where do I need to go? There's so many choices. Well, to understand this and how constraints plays approach, let's look at the difference between two different types of throwing in sports, pitching in baseball and bowling in cricket, okay? So the top there is showing a cricket bowler, right? And so if we look at the solution they're coming up with, you can see it in the image, right? Their arm is very locked and straight. So if I map that onto my solution space, where that solution lies in my solution space, right? It's with an elbow angle of roughly 0, right? As I'm going to define it, right? So that it's pointing to the point on the graph where the elbow angle is 0, okay? Compare that to the baseball pitcher below. You can see clearly they're not using a straight arm, right? They're not keeping their arm straight the whole time. Their elbow angle is close to 90 degrees, right? So I put their where they end up in the solution space, their coordination solution is very, very different. It's a totally different place. So what the question we want to ask is, and how we can understand the role of constraints is, why did these two performers, even though, right, their goal is pretty close to the same, right? They're both trying to throw a ball, so it makes it difficult for a batter to hit it. Right? So why do they come up with such different solutions, right? And the answer is constraints. So if you look at cricket, right? Within cricket, there is an additional task constraint imposed by the rules, right? The regulation of the rules in cricket are that you're not allowed to bend your arm, okay? Essentially, you're allowed to have a bend that's kind of considered natural, which is about 15 degrees. Anything beyond that, it's going to be an illegal bowl, right? It's going to be illegal pitch, and it won't be counted, right? So cricket has this additional task constraint imposed on it that baseball does not, right? And we can represent that in the solution space, right? So constraint, what I'm going to conceptualize constraints are these big black bars, right? So that rule basically says, right, you have to be within the solution space, you have to be in this area, right? That's why we call it a constraint. It's constraining where you're allowed to be in the solution space, right? So cricket, I have to be between 0 and 15 degrees elbow angle, right? I'm not allowed to go outside that, right? So now the question mark of where do I go, it has to be in that zone, right? So that's what we mean by constraint. A constraint is something added to the solution space that's going to limit my possible choice of solution, right? Where I can end up with my coordination solution. And this idea was, of course, first popularized and brought into the area of motor control. It actually was from Kelso and Kugler, but Newell was the one that really formalized it all in his constraints model. And his idea was that coordination emerges from this interaction of the constraints, right? We solve the degrees of freedom problem by reacting to the constraints. The constraints guide us to a particular area in the solution space, right? And a particular coordination solution. That's Newell's idea, right? And there's this famous constraints triangle showing there's 3 different types of constraints, which I'm going to get into in a second, right? So constraints limit the areas of solution space we can fall into, right? And help determine what the coordination solution is going to be for any skill, Okay, that's the idea of a constraint. So my definition of a constraint, I'm actually going to build it in two parts today in this video, right? So this is constraints definition 1.0, right? This is the most basic definition of a constraint. So I would define a constraint as a feature of an individual, a task, or the environment, which acts as a boundary in solution space, okay? So it constrains the possible coordination solutions that can be used. And the analogy I'm going to use today a lot is that of a fence, right? So if you imagine solution space is like a big open field, you can go anywhere in the field you want, right? You can walk anywhere you want. A constraint is a fence, right? You can't go there, right? We're putting a fence up. You're not allowed to go over to that part of the field, right? So that's the way I like to think of a constraint. Constraint, as I've talked about in my podcast, the term has kind of a negative connotation, right? It seems to be limiting, restricting, right? Constraints often we think about in terms of prisoner, right? Handcuffs are constraints. But constraints are really important, right? For one, without them, it would be essentially impossible to solve the degrees of freedom problem, or at least it would take us a long, long time. Like even if we didn't have individual constraints, right, we would have nowhere to know where to go in the field, right? It would be very, very difficult. And also we're going to see later on with the constraints-led approach, manipulating them is a really powerful coaching approach, right? So even though it has kind of a negative terminology, they're very, very powerful and useful. Okay. At this point, a key point I want to make is one that I talked about when I was looking at the two skill acquisition approaches. So Newell's constraints model, which talks about this constraints triangle in these task, environmental, individual constraints, is actually a large theory that can be applied to a lot of different things. His original chapter where he put this out was not even talking about skill and motor control. It was talking about motor development in kids, right? So it's a very large theory that can be applied to anything. And in terms of coaching, it can be applied to explain almost any coaching method, right? Observational learning is a type of constraint. Prescriptive instruction, as I'll get into detail in a little later on, is kind of a constraint, right? So the constraints model, the idea that coordination emerges from the interaction of constraints, is different than the constraints-led approach, which is a very specific way of manipulating constraints with a specific goal in mind, right? So it's really, really important to know these two things are different. Okay, so I think that's a key point that I want to keep making. So let's look at that example. How do we think about prescriptive instruction in Newell's constraints? How can we understand it? Well, so this is a slide from the presentation I gave looking at the different skill acquisition approaches. So this is a very information processing based approach to teaching pitching. Okay, the throwing example. Here, what we've identified are the key technique in pitching, right? In all these different phases, right? We've talked about all the body postures you need. So here we're prescribing a technique. Here's what you need to throw. Here's the body postures you need to do. So this is a very different approach, right? Than we're going to talk about in the constraints-led approach. This is giving you the solution, the correct technique. In the constraints-led model, right? In Newell's constraints-led model, we could think about this, represent this way in solution space, right? It's like putting a little box in solution space, right? Solution space is all the possible choices you could use to solve a movement problem. We're telling you in a prescriptive instruction, the traditional information processing based approach, we're telling you, you have to be here, right? We have to be in this box. So by giving you all these instructions and about how to do the movement, those are essentially can be conceptualized as task constraints, right? They're very, very constraining task constraints. So we basically reduce the field to a little pen that you have to live in, right? So we can conceptualize prescription instruction in that way. So I just wanted to show that. So what are the types of constraints, right? So what are the different types in Newell's model in his triangle, right? So we've, as I mentioned, there's three basic types, task, environmental, and individual, or sometimes people call them organismic. What are these different ones and how do they relate to each other? And so for this, if you read Newell's writing and other people's writing, you'll see they get into more categories and definitions. I just want to give kind of a very basic understanding of what they are here and give kind of a high-level explanation. So the easiest one to start with for me, right, is environmental constraint, okay? So my definition of an environmental constraint is a feature of the performance environment, okay? So it's not the individual, it's something outside of the individual, which constrains the coordination solution largely independently of the task being performed, okay? So I'm going to get to what I mean by that in a second, right? So another way to think of it, it's going to apply to almost any skill you try to do, okay? Environmental constraints. Another key feature of an environmental constraint is they're relatively time independent. And by that, I mean they change very, very slowly in the time scale of sports where things happen in milliseconds and seconds. Environmental constraints are going to change over minutes, hours, weeks sometimes. And classic examples of environmental constraints are things like the temperature, the surface friction, whether you're playing on a dry field or a muddy field, how bright it is out, wind, gravity, etc. There's lots and lots of different things. But let me use an example to illustrate this idea of the independence. Okay, so imagine you're at a park, and I'm going to use this example again in a second in a different way. You walk up to a park and people are playing football, they're playing soccer, they're playing baseball, tennis, archery. Okay, they're playing all these different sports. You're standing there and suddenly a big wind kicks up, a big gust of wind. That is going to affect playing all of those sports, right? All of those skills, right? The football player, if they want to throw the ball the same distance, they're going to have to throw it harder. They're going to have to into the wind. They're going to have to recalibrate. You know, the soccer players, maybe they won't be able to run as quickly. The archer is going to have to recalibrate their aim, right, to offset the wind, right? So an environmental constraint has an effect independent of the task, right? It's going to influence them differently, and I'll get to that in a second, but it's going to have kind of a general effect on all skills and tasks. Okay, so that's how I like to think of environmental. It's not specific to any one task. Contrast that with a task constraint, okay? A task constraint, for me, the definition is features of the performance environment, again, outside of the individual, which constrain the coordination solution. They put you in a certain area of the solution space, but they're highly dependent on the specific task being performed, right? So they're very, very task dependent. They're also relatively more time dependent, right? So typically task constraints can change very, very quickly in the matter of seconds. Examples of these are, the number and pace spacing of players, which can change very quickly in a game. Things that don't tend to change. There's also ones that don't tend to change, like rules, right? Size of the ball we use, the time we give you to perform something, right? These are all task constraints. Using my park example, right? Let's illustrate the difference between a task and environmental constraint, okay? Imagine now I go to the park. People are playing the same sets of sports, baseball, tennis, soccer, archery. I walk up there, and my job was to bring the soccer ball that day, and I accidentally forgot my soccer ball, and I bought a futsal instead, right? A futsal is a ball that's smaller and heavier, basically. If I did that, it's going to affect the soccer players, right? It's going to affect their coordination solution when dribbling, kicking, passing, right? It's a different weight ball, different size. So it's going to affect them. It's going to constrain their solutions, right? It's going to have absolutely no effect on the people playing football or the people doing archery or the people playing tennis, right? So a task constraint is specific to the skill you're performing, right? So it's very, very specific and dependent on the skill you're performing, right? So that's how in my mind, I distinguish between task and environmental constraints. The last one is individual constraints. So these are features of the individual, not the environment, okay, that constrain the coordination solution, right? And there's two basic types. One is kind of structural constraints that tend to change very slowly, if at all. Things like your body mass, your height, your flexibility, your strength, and so on, okay? And then there's also what sometimes Newell refers to as functional constraints. And these are more behavioral characteristic. He talks about things like motivation and attention, but I think we can also apply things like fatigue here. And this is where we also get into this issue of what's called intrinsic dynamics, okay? these are, I'm not going to get into these today. I'm going to save that for another episode another video focused on terminology. Basically, it's just your coordination tendencies, right? So an individual brings all these abilities and capacities and tendencies and to the equation, right? All of these things serve to constrain the solution you come up with as well. Okay, so there's the basic idea. Another critical point to understand here about constraints, and for this, I'm using a really nice figure I like from Franz Bosch from his book. And this is the idea that constraints interact with each other, right? So the way that Franz conceptualizes in his diagram is constraints are like putting a ripple in a pond, dropping a pebble in a pond, and it sends out ripples, right? So you're sending out ripples from each corner of the triangle with the different constraints, and they're going to interact with each other to produce different patterns on the water, okay? So for example, the effect of wind, which is an environmental constraint, is going to depend on how much your skill or sport relies on putting the ball high in the air, right? Which is a task constraint. The effect, if I ask you to start using a heavier bat, which is a task constraint, it's going to depend on the effect is going to depend on how fatigued you are, which is an individual constraint, right? So although we can put them in these little neat categories, in practice, they're always interacting with each other. They're always in, and this is part of, as I talked about on my first episode on terminology, this is a part of the wonder of this complex system. Okay, where we have the inputs are interacting in unpredictable ways. The constraints, are essentially the inputs here, and they're such that the system is largely unpredictable, right? In most cases, right? There's some situations if we really push the system, right, make you move really fast in a short time period, we can get to a more predictable thing where we know what the constraints are doing and how they interact. But that's really an important point. The constraints are always interacting with each other. Okay, so that's the basic idea of constraints. Constraints are the most important point to take away. Constraints are something that limit the coordination solution you can come up with. They constrain it. They limit the solution space you can go into when you're trying to solve a movement problem. Okay, so that's the most important idea from that. Now let's look at the constraints-led approach to coaching, right? So here, we're not talking about a universal theory that can explain development and all different. We're talking about using constraints in a highly specific way to achieve specific objectives, okay? And for me, right, I tend to have, admittedly, I think I have a more narrow definition of what the constraints-led approach is than most people. But to me, it makes the most sense. If you get it too broad, then to me, it loses its meaning. For example, if the constraints-led approach is manipulating any constraint in practice in any way, then to me, it's meaningless, right? Because as I showed in that earlier example, prescriptive instruction would be constraints-led approach then, right? So to me, it has to be a bit more concise and defined than that. So for me, my definition of the constraints-led approach in coaching is deliberately manipulating constraints in practice. Okay, we're going to do one or more in order to achieve these four things, right? And not all examples might have every one of these perfectly, but I think effective CLA manipulations have all of these things. First, we're going to destabilize an existing non-optimal movement solution, right? So we're starting with the point that we have a performer that they're doing something, their solution, where they are in the solution space, the coordination solution they come up with, we don't like for some reason, right? I'll show you, I'm going to show specific examples. Two common things that could be, we know that they could achieve, it's not optimal for them. They could be forming better if they did something else. For example, freezing degrees of freedom, really restricting your movement is finding a coordination solution, but it's not a very good one, right? And if you go to my other presentation, I show you an example of why this is the case. The other reason we might want to move you is because we know that's going to likely lead to injury, okay? So we want to destabilize this, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Two, the purpose of adding this constraint, and this is probably the single most important point, is that we want to encourage you to explore and self-organize. We're constraining to afford, as Stu Armstrong likes to say, right? We're not constraining to give you a solution. We're constraining to make you wander out into the field, right? The fence is there to push you and make you wander and look around. The third is we're going to our good constraints manipulation, the good use of the CLA is going to amplify information and invite affordances, right? So this is the idea, again, the same kind of idea as the exploration. We're putting up defense to help you find something better, not just take something away. And the fourth one is a good constraints-led approach manipulation is going to provide what Newell calls transition feedback. Transition feedback, I'm going to define more in a second, is it's going to give you information about whether your exploration is going well, whether you're headed in a good direction or not, right? So these are the four key features for me, right, that have to be there. As I said, some of them, some CLA doesn't quite have the transition feedback, but the first two are probably the most important here. Okay, so let's get into this in a little more detail and get into some specific examples. Okay, what do I mean by destabilizing a solution, right? Well, this goes back to the first video I did on terminology when we talked about attractors, right? So remember what we were talking about. We have this solution space, any of these possible solutions. We know that people will tend to go to certain spots in the solution space, right? These are certain locations because these are where the attractors are, right? And attractors, to connect it all together, are created by constraints, right? So usually a attractor is created by your individual constraints. But the important point is here that attractors vary in their stability, right? How stability means to me, once you get there, how easy is it to push you away from it, right? So think of as a coach, think of a performer serving a ball or throwing in a certain way. If they start doing it, how easy is it to get them to do something else, right? If it's difficult, that's a really stable attractor. And in kind of diagrams and illustrations of attractors, this is indicated by the depth of the well. So those figures on the right are again from something I showed last time. Here are the representation of the attractors when you're drumming, right? When you're doing a drumming movement. And remember I said when you move slowly enough, there's two attractors. People can either do in-phase attractors, where they're hitting the table at the same time with the drumsticks, or they can do anti-phase, like a drum roll, where one's up in the air and one's down. Represented in this figure, it's showing that, in general, that the in-phase attractor is more stable, right? Think about what happens if you dropped a ball down that well, right? How hard would it be to get it out, right? You'd really have to rock the system to get it climb up the hill and out the well. The anti-phase attractors are shallower, okay? So they're less stable. It's much easier to rock the system and get it out of the well. And so destabilizing, what we mean by that is we're going to change something about the constraints. I just put task constraints. That's what we usually do. It could be other constraints, but we usually do task constraints because we want to move the system away from the attractor. An example of that is shown on the figure in the right again, right? In the drumming example, if I manipulate the task constraint of drumming speed, that's a task constraint telling you how fast you have to drum, and usually I could give you a metronome to show you how fast you have to go. What that does is destabilizes the system. What it does is it destabilizes the anti-phase attractor, right? You no longer can perform the task goal using that solution, right? So I've kicked you out of that solution, right? So that's essentially what we want to do in the CLA. We want to kick you away from the one you're using. We want to make that solution less stable and push you out of it, right? So that's what we mean by destabilization. The transition feedback, the other one, this is a really interesting idea by Newell, and I'm going to give a specific example of this again, but transition feedback is information that relates to what you need to do, the solution you need to come up with, right? So it's telling you where you're going, where you need to head, okay? It's not so much telling you about what you did, right? That's performance feedback, knowledge of results, knowledge of performance. And it's not telling you the solution. It's not telling you here, this is what you need to do. It's telling you whether you're moving in a good direction, right? And this isn't a perfect analogy, but what the analogy that I came up with is when you play hide and seek and you play hot, you say hot or cold, right? When someone's moving in the wrong direction, you say cold. When they're moving in the right direction, you say hot, right? It falls apart a little because there's obviously a right answer there where the person is actually hiding, whereas there's not necessarily a right answer here. But the idea here is that we're giving people information about the effectiveness of their exploration, right? whether they're moving in a good direction. And as I said, I will give you an example of that in a second. Okay. So building all this together with the four criteria of the constraint set approach, here's my redefinition of what a constraint is. And this is the one that kind of I like to use. So this is 2.0. We had the basic one. Now we've basically just added one word. A constraint is a feature of an individual task or environment which acts as an informative boundary in solution space, right? So it constrains the possible coordination solutions, right, by putting up a fence saying you can't go to this part of the field. But at the same time, the fence provides you information about where different place you should go, okay? It helps guide your search to a more effective one. So that's what I mean by informative. It's restricting some solutions while at the same time helping you find another one, okay? So to put all this together and hopefully make this more concrete, let's look at a specific example, okay? So here we have someone pitching, right? So we have someone pitching a baseball, and that's their existing solution, right? And their existing solution is going to be a trajectory, right? It's not going to be, in most skills we're talking about, because it's not just one single point of movement in time. The coordination solution is going to be a trajectory through solution space, right? You're going to start in one point in solution space, maybe with the arm straight, and by the end of it, it's going to be bent, right? So that's the way we represent. And so I've drawn this with that brown line, orange line. Again, don't take it too seriously. It's not meant to be the actual angles they go through here. So this is a solution space that the person is using, okay? The constraint-led approach is effectively, the analogy I like to use, it's putting up a new fence, right? It's putting up a new fence in solution space saying, nope, you can't go over there, right? You need to come up with something new that doesn't go over the fence, right? So you can see the old solution is going over the fence. I want you to come up with something new that doesn't cross that fence, right? So that, to me, is kind of the logic of the constraint-led approach. Again, let's look at a specific example. Okay, so the specific example I want to use is my favorite one, talking about using the connection ball and pitching. Okay, so here's what we start with. So in baseball pitching, some pitchers you see have an issue what's called forearm flyout, right? And that's illustrated in this image here. Basically, their arm is separating too far from their body during the throwing motion, right? So their arm is coming away from their body and bending more than we'd like. The reason that this is a non-optimal solution is for two reasons. One is it puts a huge amount of torque on the elbow, which in many ways that knows about baseball, pitchers have elbow injuries all the time, have to have their ligament replaced in Tommy John surgery. So we don't want that. Also, it's very likely, and I make this point a lot in the podcast, often things that cause injury are also likely to limit performance, right? Because in this case, when we separate our arm too early or too far, we're breaking the kinetic chain, right? So in pitching, we're transferring all these forces from the ground, right, up through our lower body, our legs, into our torso. We want to transfer it continuously and smoothly all the way to our hand and letting the ball go. Pulling your arm away from your body is essentially taking all those forces, strong forces moving up your body and condensing them all into your elbow, right, which is going to likely lead to lower velocity than you could possibly achieve, and also the injury concern, right? So constraint-led approach, first thing, right, we want the solution, we need a good reason for wanting to get rid of it, not because it's just unorthodox or we don't like the way it looks, right? So that's an important point. So we're starting with this. This is our solution. Now we want to look at how we can use the constraint-led approach to address this issue. So one common way that people do it is using what's called a connection ball. So the connection ball is this big yellow rubber ball, right? Funnily enough, I experience this all the time. A lot of the constraints manipulations I end up using involve kids' toys, which brings into, I'll show another one in a minute, which brings into, your question, your authority sometimes, but it's fun. So what we're going to do is this is a video from Driveline showing a young pitcher doing. What we've done is we're adding the task constraint. So they have to start with this connection ball held between their arm and their body. And we're adding the task constraint. Their main goal is still to pitch the ball as with high velocity and accuracy towards their target on that wood wall. But we've added the task constraint. I want you to make the connection ball move towards the place you're pitching. Move it forward, okay? So let's look at, see if this video plays, right? So you can see the kid, he's grabbing the ball, right? So I want you, when the ball's going to fall out at some point, obviously arm has to separate from your body to throw, but so that's a good example. That's what we want, right? The connection ball is going forward, right? I think there's coming an example here where he gets a bad one. It goes, see, that one went more sideways, right? So we're giving this new task, right, with this connection ball. You see sometimes it went forward like we want, right? They achieved the goal we set for them. Sometimes it went sideways, which is not the goal we wanted, right? How is this a good example of the constraints-led approach? Well, let's look at my 4 criteria I created, right? Destabilization, right? There's no possible way you can achieve the goal I set for you of making that yellow ball go forward by separating your arm early, right? If your arm separates early from your body, it's always going to go sideways, right? Right? Think about it. That you have to carry the ball with your momentum forward to make it go forward, right? If you separate early, it's going to fall sideways. So I'm destabilizing the solution. Your old solution of separating forearm flyout won't work. You'll never be able to achieve this new goal I've set for you. Exploration and self-organization. At no time in that video or when you do this, do we ever tell the pitcher how to do it, right? All we tell them is what we want. We want the ball to go forward. How, when you move your arm, where you adjust, we never ever tell that, right? So we're allowing for exploration, you figure it out, and self-organization. Amplifying information and affordances. So in terms of information, having that ball against your arm and squeezing it is giving you additional proprioceptive information, your body, that you don't normally have about where your arm is relative to the rest of your body in pitching. We're also inviting a new affordance. We want you to throw harder, right? And you could pair this with a radar gun if you wanted and kind of give people feedback and show, when you do this, kind of keep the arm in and keep the kinetic chain together, you actually throw harder. So we're inviting this performance. And for me, this is an example, maybe not a perfect example of what Newell meant, but for me, this is the general idea, right? So the direction the connection ball is going when it falls out, right? That's not your main task, right? Your main task is throwing the baseball, right? The ball towards the wood and getting it velocity, right? That's what performance you care about. Where the connection ball goes is telling you about how your exploration is succeeding, right? So if I throw one pitch and the ball goes completely sideways, and then the next pitch it goes slightly forward, that to me is telling me that I'm heading in the right direction for a new effective solution. Whatever I did to change between those two, which is not going to be conscious, is an effective movement in the right direction. I'm walking in the right direction in the field. So the direction the ball falls out for me is a good example of transition feedback. It's telling me about where I need to go in the future, the effectiveness of my exploration. This is sometimes referred to in I did a podcast episode on this, and Jacobs and Michaels in their direct learning theory. This is information for learning. It's kind of another concept, right? So for me, this exercise has all the elements of a good constraints-led approach manipulation. Now let's look at a different one that's not the constraints-led approach, right? And again, this is using the connection ball, and it's using it for the same reason, right? So this is important. This is the important point I try to stress. Whether you follow an information processing approach or an ecological approach, a lot of it is using the same, addressing the same problems, using the same tools, using the same methodology, but in very, very different ways, right? So I'm going to show you this video. The sound isn't on, but I think you can tell what's going on just by watching this person. So that's a coach that's demonstrating this here, right? So what you can see here is he is using the connection ball, right, to illustrate to the young pitchers what the correct position should be, right? So he's telling them, here's where I want you to be now. Here's where you should be. Here's how you should move. In other words, he's giving them the solution to solve this problem of forearm flyout. This is where your arm should be. So the connection ball is going to help them feel where the right solution should be, right? The correct positions you want when throwing, right? So this is using a connection ball for prescriptive instruction, right? It's using it to support the development of an ideal technique. I'm going to cue you. I'm going to let you feel the right positions, right? So it's the same ball, same tool, same problem, but used in a very different way. And so if we analyze this in terms of my 4 criteria for the CLA, right, we can see that it's clearly not the CLA. It is destabilizing, right? Not in the same, information processing, you wouldn't talk about attractors, but we are creating a thing, if you hold that ball in like he wants you to, you can't do it by separating your arms. So we are destabilizing that, I'll give that. Exploration and self-organization, no, right? It's not, the connection ball is not promoting either of those things. It's there to give you the correct technique, help you learn the correct technique, right? And that's where, as I'll show you, that's where a lot of the things that people have manipulated in the past, like the size of the number of players on the field, the size of the field, yes, they've been used before, but they've not been used to promote number 2 there, right? That's the big thing that's new and different. Amplifying information. Yes, the using the connection ball in this way that coach is doing it, right? And this is just a different technique, right? It's a very, a lot of people like this approach. It is giving you additional proprioceptive information. It's letting you feel the correct positions he wants. It's not doing affordances at all, right? Affordances are invitations or opportunities you can take whether you want or not, right? He's not doing that. He's telling you what you should do. And in a prescriptive approach like this idea of transition feedback is not really necessary or even make any sense, right? You're not slowly wandering your way from an old technique to a new technique trying to find it such that you need feedback to guide you. I'm telling you the new technique, right? And if we want to use my hide and seek analogy, it's saying the person's behind the couch, not you're hot or cold, right? It's telling you the solution, right? So for me, this is not a constraint set approach because it's missing several of the key features that I think are essential for the constraint set approach. Okay, so it doesn't have either of those things. Okay. Another way to put this, think of these 2 contrasts, a way to contrast an information processing and ecological approach is putting up 1 fence versus putting up 4 fences, right? So in the constraint set approach, we're putting up 1 fence, 1 constraint, telling you you can't go over there, but there's a huge field of potential solutions, that red area. In prescriptive instruction, we're putting up 4 fences. We're putting up a pen, a really small pen that puts you in this area we want. So your potential solutions, yes, there's still some room for variation and finding your own individuality, but compared to the constraint set approach, it's tiny, right? That's prescriptive instruction. Okay. Here's an example I wanted to show you. This is a real state space. This is from a really wonderful paper by Tim Buzzard and colleagues in Nature that we discussed actually in the Journal Club #1. So on this if you like this video, go check out my playlist of journal clubs. We have lots to talk about, lots of these things. The last one we talk about some constraint set approach. The first one we talk about Tim's paper, and Tim's paper is about using a constraint set approach by scaling equipment in tennis. So by giving kids smaller rackets and lower compression balls. But I love this figure because it kind of illustrates the same thing I was talking about. So this is the state space created by the angle between your forearm and your upper arm when you're doing a stroke in tennis, right? The blue is what you get when you give kids an adult racket and try to teach them the traditional tennis stroke, right? So you get that blue movement, that blue trajectory. The red is what you get is if you give them a smaller racket, lower compression balls, and kind of let them explore. And so to me, this wonderfully illustrates kind of the same concept. The traditional approach is putting you in this box. Here's where I want the solution to be. The ecological approach of using the CLA is allowing you to explore much wider parts of the field, much wider range of the solution space. So that is what they actually look like, just so you know. And again, we went into detail about this in that journal club. We talked about this paper if you're interested. Okay. So those are a couple examples of the CLA. There's many, many others, things that you can manipulate. Usually we almost always manipulate task constraints. Okay, we talked about equipment size. Another common one is the space and density of players in the small-sided game approach. We can manipulate the time people have. We can add new rules and instructions, right? You have to pass the ball 3 times before you shoot is adding a task constraint, right? That's going to change people's solutions. And along with the Journal Club number 1, I would recommend you check out one of the more recent ones, number 22, where we talked about using constraints in baseball. There's some good examples there. So I'm not going to go into all the possibilities. One of the most fun parts of using the constraints-led approach for me, and one of the reasons I like it, is there's it seems like an infinite number of possibilities you can use. And it's really fun kind of exploring and coming up with different constraints you can use. One point I want to make, and I made this a little bit earlier, is the CLA constraints-led approach is often being accused of using old wine in new bottles, right? It's slapping fancy terms and new names on things that have been used for years. And I can understand why people make that point, right? They make that point because the tools, the equipment, and the manipulations, like reducing the side of the field, using less players on a field, the connection ball, they've been used for years and years, right? So those are old, right? What's new is the goal in the way we use it, right? So the new goal is self-organization, not prescriptive instruction, not understanding the correct technique, right? And so what's new is these tools that have been around for a long time, these techniques are being used in an ecological approach instead of an information approach, right? So it's not just rehashing things and slapping a new label on it. It's using it in a fundamentally, completely different way, right? So that's really important. So to end off, I wanted to just give a few tips that I found. I'm not going to, as I said, my resource page has tons more, and you can dig into the studies about this. But I want to give 2 tips that I've noticed in trying to come up with good constraints in the different sports that I work in and consult in. Okay. The first thing to note is that designing effective constraints is an iterative, explorative process in and of itself, right? You need to try different things, play around with different things, right? Your likelihood you're going to come up with a perfect one for your sport on the first try is low, right? So you need experiment. Other things I've noticed, if you can somehow come up with a physical constraint instead of adding more and more rules, I think that's better, right? So a lot of people find it easy to add rules, like you have to pass the ball 3 times. You're not allowed to go there, So the verbal instructions, which are rules for how you perform the task. And those are fine, but I personally find if you give too many of those, people are too consciously thinking. You got to remember all those, and it gets difficult. If you can add something that physically takes away a solution instead, like the connection ball, to me, that's much more effective. Another effective thing is coming up with converging constraints instead of just using one. So by that, I mean coming up with multiple different ways to destabilize the same solution with different constraints, right? So my example I gave on my website, if you have a baseball back catcher that's trying to catch balls in the dirt with their glove, which is is going to lead to a lot of misses, you can make them perform the task with their arms behind the back, so they have to block with their body. That's one constraint. Then you could do a separate one with a really bouncy rubber ball, right? That's a different constraint. Those are converging because they're trying to achieve the same thing, right? The taking away this solution we don't like. Another really effective thing that I think most people know of is using amplification of error. We talked about this in the Journal Club number 22 I mentioned. These figures are from Martin Nyhoff and Paul Venner and their colleagues. What we're showing here is the top is showing a pitcher. Again, we're sticking with pitcher. They're landing. We don't like the way they're landing. They're not landing square. Their foot is rolling, right? Again, high chance of injury. The way that Martin and Paul and colleagues address this, one of the ways is having a pitcher throw in sand, right? So sand is an environmental constraint, right? It's changing the surface. If you roll your foot when you land in sand, you're going to almost fall over, right? We're exaggerating your error, okay? We're doing the same thing, destabilizing it by using an environmental constraint there. Other couple tips I would give is consider trying to manipulate individual constraints, right? We focus on a lot on the task, but consider fatiguing an individual in different ways, working on strength. And this is the last one, and related to this is something Paul Venner really nicely emphasizes, that we can add constraints in the weight room that really connect and mirror the constraints we use performing a skill, okay? So the example he gives, if we have that pitcher landing, they're not landing square on their foot, the skill drill might be throwing in the sand. In the weight room, we could do a lunge where you have to land on the top of a box, plant your foot with weight, right? You cannot, that is achieving the same thing. If you're rolling your ankle when you land, you're not going to be able to use as heavy a weight. It's going to be a very uncomfortable exercise. So that's an S&C exercise that is adding a constraint, that box you have to land on, that is achieving the same goal as the quote unquote skill exercise of pitching in the sand. And to me, that's a perfect example of this convergence I meant, right? These two different manipulations achieving the same goal. When you can do that, that's super, super powerful. Okay, so that's it for my run through constraints. As I said, you can find a lot more about this and all the things on my website. If this is the first video you're seeing of me, check out the Perception Action podcast where I talk about all of these issues in more glorious detail and interview people that know more about them than me. So thanks very much and cheers for now.